Thank you so much for braving the inclement weather, but I don't think you're going to be disappointed. We have a really good panel to discuss some very important topics. I'm Barbara Slavin. I'm the acting director of the Future of Iran initiative at the Atlantic Council. And we're here today to talk about the implications of the rift between Saudi Arabia and Iran for regional stability and also for the economies and the oil market in particular in the region. It's hard to overstate the tragedy, certainly, that we're seeing in Syria. And we're going to talk about that a great deal and to what extent the Iran-Saudi rift is responsible for the tragedy unfolding there and to what extent there are other factors. I think you probably know a lot of our speakers, but let me just briefly introduce them to you. First, we have our own Fred Hoff from the Hariri Center. Fred is a former U.S. Army officer and diplomat who served on the commission that investigated the 1983 bombing of the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut. He was also chief of staff of the Sharm el-Sheikh Fact-Finding Commission, headed by former Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell. He was in the State Department during President Obama's first term and took the lead in an effort to mediate Syrian-Israeli peace. Boy, that seems a long time ago. And he was given the rank of ambassador in his capacity as special advisor to the Secretary of State for Transition in Syria. And we are seeing a transition, but maybe it's not the one that we had hoped for. Then we're delighted to have Amir Hanjani to speak here. Amir is president of PG International Commodity Trading Services, which imports a wide variety of agro-commodities such as wheat, corn, raw sugar, feed grain, and vegetable oil. He's been instrumental in facilitating humanitarian trade into Iran. He's a member of the board of directors of RAK Petroleum PLC. Is it RAK or RAK? An exploration and production company listed on the Oslo Stock Exchange, and PT Capital, an Arctic resource asset management firm. Amir is a Truman National Security Fellow. He's a member of the board of the Atlantic Council, and he's also a member of our advisory board for our Iran initiative. Then we have Sarah Vakshuri, also of the Atlantic Council. She's a non-resident senior fellow with our Global Energy Center. She's also founder and president of SVB Energy International, a strategic energy consulting firm based in Washington. She's an internationally recognized expert on global energy market studies, energy security, and geopolitical risk, with a special focus on the Middle East, Iran, and Mexico. Sarah worked in both the public and private sectors of the Iranian energy industry from 2000 to 2008, including at the National Iranian Oil Company, so she has a lot of insights about Iran's strategy for dealing with Saudi production, overproduction, I guess we can say. And finally, I'm really delighted to have David Ottaway here. David is someone I've known for many years. He's a senior scholar now at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, but he was a foreign correspondent and a diplomatic and security correspondent for 35 years at the Washington Post, spent a lot of time in the Middle East. He's won numerous awards for his reporting. And he's written many books, including The King's Messenger, Prince Bandar bin Sultan and America's Tangled Relationship with Saudi Arabia. He's working on another book now on Tunisia and Egypt, and he was recently in Saudi Arabia in December, so he has a very good sense of what the Saudi mood is right now about regional developments. So let's get started. Fred, I'm so happy to be on a podium with you, and I'm so happy to be able to ask you some really pertinent questions. We have a situation now where, as you know better than anyone, the Russians have changed the facts on the ground in Syria. With their air power and the Iranians, the Shia militias from Iraq, Afghanistan, Lebanon that have been fighting in Syria, it looks entirely possible that Aleppo may fall to them. So I guess the question I have for you is, to what extent is the Iran-Saudi rift instrumental in this? Can you distinguish at all between Iranian motives here and Russian motives? And what is the outlook now for this conflict? What, if anything, can Saudi Arabia and the United States do to prevent what looks like the inevitable?
Well, Barbara, first of all, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this panel, and thank you for the terrific work the Iran-related work you're doing for the Atlantic Council. It's really given the organization a profile that's quite excellent on these issues. Iran and Saudi Arabia have basically been engaged in a proxy war in Syria ever since the Assad regime succeeded in militarizing the uprising against it. So we're talking the better part of 4 years. Iran has generally had the upper hand, not always, but generally. In addition to its own Revolutionary Guard Corps assets in Syria, it's been able to draw its Lebanese militia, Hezbollah, into the fight. It's been able to count on steady Russian logistical support for Assad's army. Nevertheless, last summer, Assad's forces in the northwest of Syria in particular were on the back foot. And this is what brought the Russians in on September 30th. This is what caused them to deploy significant combat air assets to Syria. Now, as he did in 2013, when Hezbollah came to the rescue of Bashar al-Assad, our Secretary of State, John Kerry, is attempting to launch a diplomatic initiative that essentially attempts to make diplomatic outcomes overcome military facts on the ground. This is not an easy task, to say the least. Even if one believes that ultimately there is no military solution to the Syrian crisis, I think one can also believe that diplomatic outcomes generally reflect military facts on the ground. Now, Russia entered Syria on the wings of a disinformation campaign suggesting that it was coming in to fight ISIL, Daesh. It's very clear from the content of the military campaign that is not the Russian objective. For diplomatic reasons, John Kerry elected to try to play judo with the Russian assertion, positing and perhaps believing that ISIL is a common enemy for Washington, Tehran, and Moscow. To the extent our Secretary of State actually believed this to be the case, I'm quite sure he's since been disabused of it, given facts on the ground. For Moscow, Tehran, and the Assad regime, ISIL in Syria is a gift that just keeps on giving. The so-called and self-proclaimed caliph, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, serves as a wonderful foil for Bashar al-Assad. Even though Assad is the person principally responsible for 200,000 civilian deaths, 4.5 million refugees, 6.5 million displaced, tens of thousands in prison, nevertheless, Assad has never, to the best of my knowledge, beheaded anybody publicly or burned anybody alive publicly. Baghdadi, in many respects, is his potential ticket back to polite society. I think the Russians and Iranians understand this fully, and their objective, and this is obvious from the content of the military campaign, their objective is to eliminate all alternatives to Assad and Baghdadi in Syria, thereby confronting the West, led by the United States, with a really horrific binary choice between the two. Russia and Iran end up in the same place in terms of perpetuating Assad, but I think they come come to it from slightly different motives. For Putin, the motive is to defeat what he characterizes as the American worldwide regime change and democratization jihad. This is how Putin has characterized it, basically at the Security Council and elsewhere. And if he thinks that if he can defeat it in Syria, and defeating it in Syria by definition means keeping Assad in power, this will be a tremendous diplomatic coup for Russia. It will signal Russia's full comeback as a great power in the mind of Putin. For Iran, the bottom line is the same, but I think the motive is different. Tehran fully appreciates the fact that Bashar al-Assad has cooperated totally with it over the past 15 years in terms of sustaining Hezbollah in Lebanon and keeping Hezbollah fit to fight. Iran suspects, as an analytical matter, that there's not much constituency for this kind of subordinate relationship in Syria beyond the ruling family itself, and I suspect the Iranians are correct about this. Hence, they really do want to keep Bashar in power, at least in a corner of what some people refer to as useful Syria.
Useful.
Syria, adjoining the Mediterranean, Syria, adjoining the Lebanese boundary. The Obama administration launched this diplomatic process on the basis of two premises. One was the common enemy premise, and the other was that surely Russia and Iran could see their way clear to sidelining Bashar al-Assad, because unless you sideline Bashar al-Assad, the prospects of putting together a united Syrian front, army and rebels, together against ISIS, providing the long-missing ground combat component, that would be impossible. I think the combination of the nature of Russia's military campaign, and very interestingly, recently, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates have offered to provide some kind of ground combat components to the coalition in the fight against ISIS, in eastern Syria. Is this serious? Do they have the kinds of assets, ground combat assets, that could really make a difference? This is in my mind, it's questionable. Our Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter, is doing his due diligence on this as we speak. But what these announcements did provoke was a couple of really over-the-top responses. From Syria, Walid Muallim, foreign minister, saying anybody who comes into Syria is going to go home in a wooden coffin. And the head of the Revolutionary Guard Corps, who said basically the Saudis don't have the courage to do this, and it would be tantamount to committing suicide. So let me just conclude by saying that the thesis of a common enemy in terms of ISIS, I think, has been destroyed totally. And now, unfortunately, the United States is left with picking up the pieces diplomatically. And I think you're correct. I think the prospects of a Russian-supported regime military victory in northwestern Syria are quite good. Not imminent, but quite good over time. I would expect to see the Russians, with Iranian and Shia militia ground support, turn their attention to the southwest, which could be sending a new wave of refugees in the direction of Jordan, and which could conceivably bring into the act in some manner Israel. Because for Israel, the security of the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan is of extraordinary importance.
Fred, thank you. I just wanted to add one thing. I was in a Skype conversation with a Saudi general who was an advisor to Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the defense minister, and he was asked about whether Saudi Arabia was really intending to send ground forces into Syria, and he basically said, "We will if everybody else does."
No, they've made it clear it's got to be in the context of the international coalition, and that coalition needs to be led by the United States. Right. And I presume they want to see American skin in the game.
Right.
As
so
well.
I think the chances are pretty slim. Also, you know, they haven't even sent ground forces into Yemen, which is a much more pressing crisis for them. So I would rate that as rather small. Amir, let me turn to you. Let me ask about how Iranian attitudes toward Syria have evolved. I remember the last time I was there wasn't great enthusiasm for Assad, but that was before the caliphate had announced itself. And I think there has been change. And you were in Iran in November and December. So what do you think is Iranian thinking now about the crisis? And also, we've heard the Saudis, but GCC opinion about this is not exactly uniform, is it?
No, it's not. I think from the Iranian perspective, I mean, first of all, what's happening in Syria is a humanitarian catastrophe of epic proportions. I mean, it's affecting Europe. It's affecting the war on terror. So that has to be addressed, as Fred said very eloquently. It's really quite tragic. From the Iranian perspective, Syria is an existential issue. They view the Assad regime as a Shiite regime, and they view that regime as a moderate regime that is able to confront ISIS, which is an existential threat to Iran. And from Iran's perspective, ISIS and Salafi Wahhabi groups like Jabal al-Nusra, who have taken up shop in Syria, are not just a threat to Iran and the Shia faith, but a threat to Western civilization. Because what's happening now is what's going on in Syria is now being exported into Europe and other parts of the world. We saw here in San Bernardino the radicalization of groups coming from a Saudi ideology, which is Iran feels that they are at war with in the region. They find the U.S. policy quite unbelievable because they view 9/11 as the greatest terrorist attack on U.S. soil committed by 15 Saudis, masterminded by a Saudi. And then we go on to now ISIS, the Taliban, Jabal al-Nusra, Boko Haram. All of these groups have an ideology that comes from the biggest Arab ally in the region. And so Iran views U.S. policy as somewhat talking at both sides of their mouth. They want to confront ISIS, but they don't want to deal with the root of this ideology, which comes from Riyadh.
In terms of the GCC opinion, I mean, the Saudis obviously have led the charge against Iran and Iranian influence, but the entire GCC is not in lockstep, are they?
They're not. I mean, you saw the statement when they killed the Sheikh Nimr, and the Iranians raided the Saudi embassy. There was great statements of condemnation, and a couple of GCC states recalled their ambassadors. But the GCC's view on Saudi Arabia, on Iran, isn't uniform. States like the UAE, Oman, and Qatar have huge economic interests with Iran. And Iran that's trading with the world is also trading with those states. In the UAE in particular, they have a huge need for gas. And the largest gas fields that they have access to are the Iranian gas fields. And there have been discussions between not only the federal government, but each individual emirate to import Iranian gas into the UAE. And anyone who's ever been to Dubai and walks along the creek there, you'll see all these dhow boats filled with goods ready to go to Iran. And you have pretty decent-sized Shia populations in each country. that while they are not in any way for Iranian interests, they still are, are balanced in their approach to the region. So I think you see them, maybe they're giving lip service to the Saudis, but there's still 14 flights a day going from the UAE to Iran. There's still multiple flights a day going from Doha. Oman tends to view itself as a balancer of interest with Iran and Saudi.
Yeah. Is there anything that Iran can do to defuse this quarrel with the Saudis that you realistically see? I've heard Iranian officials say over and over and over again that they have reached out. I've certainly heard Javad Zarif, foreign minister, say that. And President Rouhani, his very first press conference, he said his priority was regional stability. He was going to reach out. Or is it just, given the situation in Syria right now, really impossible to think of anything that Iran could do, barring dropping Assad, which they're obviously not going to do?
Well, I think as you said, Barbara, and that's what I've heard publicly too. The Iranians have said they've said publicly we've reached out to the Saudis a number of times. The Saudis want to start the negotiation by saying you have to drop Assad first before we talk. Yeah. So they want to start the negotiation by ending it and put the terms of ending it down first. And clearly the Iranians would never do that. Assad and the Syrian regime is existential for Iran. So any settlement of the issue can't begin with you have to drop Assad and then let's talk. And I think from Iran's perspective, this Saudi proposal or offer of, we're going to put boots on the ground, I think the IRGC commander's response is probably the response of most Iranians. You can't even defeat your neighbors, a group of Houthis. How are you going to go? You're going to go put boots on the ground and fight us and Russia? Yeah. The Saudis have never done that. What they do is they export money to fundamentalist groups around the world to go about and do and fight for them. Yeah. And that's what they're good at. They're not good at putting boots on the ground and fighting themselves.
Yeah. Sarah, the story of oil prices has been certainly extraordinary. The Saudi production has been extraordinary. Now that Iran is allegedly free to sell on the international markets, how do you think this is going to work out? I mean, the Saudis have made it pretty clear that they're going to continue producing large quantities. Have they taken market share from Iran, or is it Russia or others that have actually taken market share from Iran during the period of intense sanctions?
That's a very good question, Barbara. When it comes to low oil prices and Saudis, extra import, many people simply relate that to Iran and Saudi-Iran rivalry. But this is further and more important for Saudi than just Iran. There are so many different elements. Looking at market share and global oil market, Saudi is not really too much focusing on Iran with that 1 million barrels per day, which Saudi already taken since 2012. But if you look into among the OPEC member or Arab producers of Persian Gulf, Iraq has the hugest production jump and production ramp up, way more than Saudi Arabia in the past few years. And the commitment of Iraqi government to all of these companies that have been invested in Iraq is in a way that Iraq cannot be committed to its OPEC quota. So Saudi realization is that, okay, we have Iraq in one hand that is going to produce, and they cannot prevent its production.
What are they up to now, 3-4 million?
Yeah, above 4.
Above 4.
And it was about more than 1 million barrels of increase. So, and then we have U.S. shale. I mean, pre this price reduction that it was expanding hugely. And then we have Russia and other non-OPEC countries. So on this side of market share battle, this is not just Iran, but also other market share battle between Saudi and other countries. So it's just a very natural decision that you are facing a market that everybody wants to increase production for different reasons. And also another important issue that happens is on the demand side. So the demand was really weakening during the high oil prices, and now there is a more positive prospects of demand growth. Something that is very important is that the U.S. market is a huge market for Saudi Arabia. Most of the U.S. refineries are refining heavy and medium grade of crude oil. There's a significant import of crude oil from Persian Gulf, from Saudi specifically. And the higher oil prices was pushing this U.S. driving demand into more cars that are using more renewable energies, like hybrid cars. But now all of these, like the prices are so low, everybody's just driving using fuel. So these are all strengthening the demand. And there are all of the expectations in the market is, at least for the next year, the demand is going to grow by 1.5 million barrels per day. So we see that if this is Saudi's policies also strengthening the demand and pushing the demand high. On the other hand is Saudi's domestic business. The Deputy Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, he's a young person and he has a lot of support among a young generation. He has started all these energy reform in Saudi Arabia, reducing the subsidies. We know that the reducing the fuel subsidies has started in Iran many years ago, but other GCC members and Arab countries were really hesitant to start this reduction of subsidies at home. Simply the legitimacy of the government and also the feeling of the people that this is our oil, is our right. So we see that all of this reform is happening in many other Gulf producers, including Saudi Arabia. So that helps also Saudi's domestic economy, also to diversify their economy. And then if we look at it into the energy, into the security component, of course, if Saudi, I think it's very important looking into the Saudi psychology. The Saudis and the Arabs are historically tribal, they have a tribal component. And with that background, when you make a friendship or alliance, that's forever. You cannot see really your friend or ally that you're counting on him or that country for securing your, or being in charge of your security, suddenly make an alliance or get close to your enemy. So I think the moment the Saudi realized that US and Iran are going to get closer, they decided that they have to take part of their security in their own hand. And they be more active in taking their security in their own hand. And at the time that the prices are lower, of course, it's easier for Saudi to look into fighting with another countries like Iran, that low oil prices is not going to give them as much as pocket money that they would have in much higher oil prices to fight. So on the energy issues, I see this as a much broader than Saudi-Iran rivalry. Saudi already has many interesting plans for increasing its market share. They have done discussions with Mexico. They are more active and they are much more ahead of Iran in securing their market share. This is not something because of 2012 sanctions. Saudi traditionally owns many refineries, shares of refineries around the world. So this is a security of supply for Saudi, which Iran doesn't have. This was part of Iran's plan since Shah of Iran. I know that NIC always was planning for this, but they never actually owned any refinery outside of Iran. So we see that Saudi already has the shares of the biggest refineries in the United States, the Port Arthur refinery in Texas. So at least they have that 1 million barrels of oil per day market share in the United States, even if all the refineries decide to change their configuration and refine the light oil. And now they're looking into Mexico, and I think that's amazing. I mean, is Saudi going to own refineries in Mexico, importing U.S. oil, and then exporting it? So it's very interesting. So they are playing a very bigger game. I don't see their game is just evolving around rivalry with Iran, but just a bigger strategic game. And something interesting about Saudi is that we think that the leadership has changed, or now there's a young prince. But the thing is that the biggest strategic decisions are made in a more longer term among like Supreme Petroleum Council or a higher level of included different power centers in Saudi. So we saw a change of leadership, but we didn't see any change of price policy in Saudi or production policy in Saudi. So I see that Saudi's decision making in a more long-term strategic decisions.
I have to ask you one question about Iran. I know Sarah's going to be speaking this afternoon about the new Iranian petroleum contracts. So I encourage you all to hang around or come back at 3 o'clock to, it's 3, right?
Yes.
Yeah, to hear her presentation. But supposedly this contract is going to be unveiled. I mean, I've been hearing now for 6 months that it's going to be unveiled, and it still hasn't been. So can you explain why the delay? Is it because of internal dissent about the nature of this contract?
Well, Iran's deputy of oil minister announced that it has been delayed because there was no UK consulate in Iran and they couldn't get visas on time. But what other companies and outside Iran read into that statement was just, okay, Iranian didn't still finalize the format of IPC. And that's very true. All the senses we get, still Iran is reforming that contract. And also there is a massive disagreement. And that problem, again, goes back to Iran. We just talked about Saudi. Even in Saudi, in Turkey, I'm not just saying that very developed economy or very much more advanced economies, in countries like Saudi or Turkey, they are all having a regulatory system that oversees the important energy decisions. But we don't have, Iran doesn't have such a system. So there are still rivalries, let's say, between Minister of Petroleum, the minister, between the hardliners, between the parliament. So these groups always use leverages against each other. So the parliament just few weeks before Iran announces, or before this conference, they started complaining and they started criticizing this contract. And I mean, looking into their comments, they might be right too, because Ministry of Petroleum cannot hold the contract secret from the parliament of a country. But perhaps they feel some rivalry. So if Iran had such a regulatory system that different power groups in Iran would look and decide on bigger decision, maybe we wouldn't see such delays after each other.
Thank you. David, you were in Saudi Arabia. You know, we've seen this rift with Iran get worse and worse. There was the horrible incident at the Hajj when hundreds of Iranian pilgrims were killed in a stampede. How important is this division with Iran to Saudi Arabia domestically, to their internal politics? Do they need to have Iran as an enemy in order to continue with their ways?
From their point of view, it's Iran who went after them ever since the 79 Islamic Revolution, when they called for the overthrow of the Saudi Al Saud family. So from their point of view, it's Iran who has looked for trouble and pushed them into a corner. And the feuding goes all the way back to the 79 revolution. And then I think we were together in Beirut when it really hit the ground, and there was with the birth of Hezbollah, and so there was the Saudi Arabia was on the other side and fighting each other in Beirut, right at the birth of Hezbollah. So this is a long feud, and is it worse today than then? Yes, because of Syria, but it really started getting worse with the Arab uprising. And the late King Abdullah was the first Arab leader to come out and say, Assad has to go. And they have been pushing this and trying to get the Americans on board for helping them overthrow Assad. And you have to remember, for years, the Obama administration was saying the same thing: Assad has to go. So they thought they were together with the United States in overthrowing Assad. And of course, they discovered that now we're sort of going in slightly different directions. But inside Saudi Arabia, there's a feeling of kind of a national necessity to stand up to Iran militarily. The Saudis feel they are the center of the Islam. They are incredibly wealthy, with the fourth largest foreign reserves in the world. That they are the swing oil producer and really are at the center of the oil market. But they have no military throw weight. They've never been able to show they can stand up and deal with Iran or Syria. They don't have a revolutionary guard. And so for them, with this feeling that the United States is slowly withdrawing from the Middle East, they realize they've got to stand up with their allies and fend for themselves. And you're seeing that's what they're doing in Yemen, where they're learning how to stand up militarily, they feel, not only to the Houthis, but to the Iranians who have been helping them. So you don't sense any division about standing up to Iran in Riyadh or Jeddah or only,
What about Qatif?
only in the eastern province where I was also in December, in Qatif, where the Shia are concentrated, do you begin to get a different feeling and a different opinion about what standing up to, they really are more sympathetic to Iran and because of the Shia connection. And also their own problems inside Saudi Arabia where they're suppressed and they feel not integrated into the economy or into the political system.
You've followed Saudi Arabia for such a long time. If indeed the Russians have won, Russians, Iranians, Assad have won, at least for now, and the chances of overthrowing that regime are really minuscule at this point. How will the Saudis react to this? I mean, they say that they're willing to take on ISIS, but they haven't shown any great enthusiasm for it. And as we heard yesterday with this general, they're not going to be the first to send troops into Syria. Will they, find some groups that they can continue to support to nibble around at the edges of the Assad regime, focus more on trying to resolve the situation in Yemen? How do you think they're going to handle this?
I think that in Syria they'll continue to help their Islamic factions that they're supporting. But I think what's going on now is this offer for send in troops, Saudi troops and UAE troops. They're turning the tables on Kerry. Kerry's been going around saying everybody has to do more, Our Arab allies have to do more. They're saying, okay, we'll do more, but you have to do more. And they know that the U.S. is not going to do more, so they're not going to have to do more. I think it's as a diplomatic ploy, I think it's a wonderful way of taking the heat off them and putting them on the United States. And they've always said in the last few days this caveat: we'll put in ground troops, but the U.S. government has to decide to lead the coalition in doing this. And the chances of that, we'll find out tomorrow because all the defense ministers are meeting in Brussels to decide what to do in the war against ISIL. But I think that they've successfully turned the tables and putting the heat on the United States to do something, and then they will join.
Fred, will the United States do something? And if so, what?
I'm not going to hold my breath, but I agree entirely with this assessment. I think it does turn the tables. Our Secretary of Defense has made a very positive response to this Gulf offer. And just by way of clarification, the Saudis are not articulating a desire to send ground troops to fight the Russians and the Syrian regime and the Iranians. They have specifically couched this in terms of being part of the anti-ISIS coalition.
They're learning from the Russians.
The anti-ISIS coalition in eastern Syria. They have, in effect, turned the tables on the American Secretary of State, but they have also succeeded in provoking from Syria and from Iran the kind of over-the-top negative statements that demonstrate that those entities want ISIS in Syria, in business, indefinitely. Iraq may be a different story entirely, but in Syria, ISIS is of unsurpassed value to the Russians, to the Iranians, and to the Assad regime. The only other comment I've made is, you don't have to You don't have to be in love with the Wahhabi school of Islam, and you certainly don't have to endorse various aspects of the military campaign in Yemen. Nevertheless, to acknowledge that there is a degree of subtlety in the approach to Syria. Saudi Arabia's position is not that Bashar al-Assad must go before negotiations take place. At the request of the International Syria Support Group, Riyadh hosted a conference where the opposition was able to form a delegation to go to Geneva. That delegation went to Geneva without any preconditions.
They didn't do much
all.
once they got there, though.
No, it was on the 3rd of September. It was suspended because what coincided with the start of the negotiations was the launch of this massive Russian military offensive in northwestern Syria. Probably not a coincidence. Probably not an accident.
And we saw the same thing this past week with Aleppo, yeah.
Indeed, and this is why our Secretary of State is having to recalculate everything and review all of the assurances he's been given by Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and the co-convener of the Vienna peace process.
So-called. All right, let me open up to all of you. Raise your hand and state your name and ask a question. First, from the colorfully dressed Harlan Ullman in the front row.
Islamic Green. I'm Harlan Ullman with the Atlantic Council. First of all, thank you. This was a really very, very interesting and useful panel. The good news is, of course, that President Trump or President Sanders is well versed on all this, and so they will be able to deal with it. If you were doing an autopsy of the region, or at least a forensic examination, I would say that the patient has 5 types of cancer and is terminal. So under these circumstances where it's almost certain the situation is likely to get worse before it gets better, if you were able to use your imagination and come up with alternative ideas of what to do, for example, it may well be that the key to Syria is Iraq. The fact is, if you can eject the Islamic State from Mosul, maybe that's the best way to start. We did have a 2-pillar policy in the good old days of the Cold War with Saudi Arabia and Iran on the same side until the Shah left. Exercising your imagination, what are the one-offs that we might be considering that we haven't considered? And I'll give you another example. Just before the NATO defense ministers meeting, the Russians launched a huge military exercise. And I will guarantee you that that exercise will take more of the time of the NAC, the North Atlantic Council's meeting, than talking about sensible solutions to the Islamic State, of which none are going to be raised, I don't think. So using your imaginations without any restraints, what are some ideas that this administration, other administrations may want to consider to see if we can reverse the trajectory, which in my mind is heading towards nadir and nothing and worse consequences?
Fred, do you want to start with that? Should we do Iraq first?
I'll start. I think Harlan. For one thing, we've got a generational struggle in the region that centers very much on the question of political legitimacy, and no matter how imaginative all of us on the panel can be, that question is really very, very difficult to address because it's going to take many years to overcome, if it is ever overcome. In terms of the current crisis, what I've been suggesting pretty consistently is a Syria first approach to the question of ISIS. Why? Because ISIS in Syria is, strictly speaking, an imposed presence. Okay, in Iraq, for better or worse, it's had an organic place in the universe of Arab, Sunni, Muslim grievances about being disenfranchised. In Syria, it is imposed. What I've suggested is basically a two-sided policy for Syria, where the United States focuses on civilian protection in Western Syria, both for humanitarian and hard, realistic policy reasons, and defeating ISIL sooner rather than later in eastern Syria. And this means putting together, ideally in the form of a coalition based on regional, perhaps some European contributors, a genuine ground combat component capable of closing with and killing ISIL. And I think the effects of that on the war in Iraq will be rather significant.
Amir, do you want to comment on how Iran would view it? I mean, I let Fred go on and on about how, you know, Iran and Russia and so on are very happy about having ISIS in Syria. I'm not so sure. What do you think their strategy is in terms, are they Iraq first? Are they, you know, stabilize Assad and then support the Iraqi forces in going into Mosul?
Can I answer Harlan's question?
Yeah,
That's
absolutely.
an excellent question. And I think the question presupposes an American mindset to the Middle East, which is the solutions come from us.
It doesn't.
Yeah, well, so I'm answering it. So I think the solutions to the problems of the Middle East lie in the Middle East. Every time we get involved in the Middle East, whether it's by ground troops or direct military involvement, the situation over time gets much worse, and we end up with our tail between our legs, either walking away or in the autopsy aftermath blaming other people for the problem. That's what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, you know, waiting to be seen, but it doesn't look good there either. So, and here we have another solution, which is let's put U.S. ground troops in a coalition. Well, I don't know any time we've led a coalition in the Middle East where we don't have the bulk of the ground forces being American boys. And I actually commend the administration for resisting that, because I don't believe that it's the U.S. national security interest to send American ground forces into Syria. And I think if you take a poll of the American public, overwhelmingly they would agree. Back to your question, Barbara, I think the Iranian view on ISIS in Syria and Iraq is a bit different. They were the first ones in Iraq to protect the Kurds. They sent planes and troops, and there was pictures of Qasem Soleimani all over Erbil and Baghdad. And they are determined not to let Erbil and Baghdad fall. That's existential for them. You can't forget that ISIS is on Iran's border in Iraq. When it comes to Syria, I think they group ISIS and all the other radical Sunni groups. And I've heard this in Washington now for many years, that there are moderate elements in Syria. I haven't seen that. I don't know who those moderate elements are. Every time there's a view of Syrian rebel groups, they tend to look pretty Salafi to me. But you know, I could be wrong. I'm not an expert.
Fred's met all 20 of them, right?
Yeah, Fred. I think last year there was someone on the Armed Services Committee from CENTCOM saying we've trained like 15 of them. So was it 5? Okay, so I stand corrected. So I think they view their view of U.S. policy toward the region is you can't be at the same time saying we're going to fight ISIS and radical Salafi Wahhabi groups without dealing with where that ideology comes from, which is Riyadh. And this is why I think I don't see hopeful until both Iran and the U.S. decide to deal with that issue, along with the Saudis, the three of them. I'm not hopeful. But I believe the solution to the problem will be Iran and Saudi Arabia eventually. And they've done this before in the past, sitting around a table and figuring out a solution. And I'm not sure the U.S. leading that discussion is in our interest.
I'm not sure we can. David.
You know, this administration has an Iraq first policy. That's where we got 5,000 troops trying to train the army. And we say we're trying to hold Iraq together. But we're really doing nothing to help the three parts, the Kurds, the Shiites, and the Sunnis, figure out how they're going to stay together. And I think we should be calling a national conference of the parties to figure out whether they're going to have a confederation, a federation, and you know what the how the pieces are going to stay together, because otherwise they're going to fly apart. So I think we do have a role we could play in Iraq to bring the parties together in some kind of a national conference so that everybody knows what the future of Iraq is going to be. Unfortunately, we're not doing anything like that.
Okay. We'll go to Faye here in the front.
Thank you very much. Faye Mokhtar, Director and Council Member. This is a great discussion. I have a question for you, Mr. Fred. You mentioned, how are we distinguishing between, I was in a Middle East Institute conference a few months ago, and we were told that there are more than 1,600 different militias in Syria, more than 1,500 militias in Iraq. How is the United States distinguishing between these militias and who is the good guy and who is the bad guy, and making sure that we do not make the same mistakes we did in the Iraq? Thank you.
Yeah, in Syria, this is an extraordinarily difficult problem. I think, you know, given from the beginning the violent onslaught of the Assad regime against civilian populations, given the deliberate release from prison of Islamist extremists, given all of this, it's not exactly surprising that number one, the response in terms of armed groups is very much localized. The reason you may have that many militias is because there are probably that many places that are under assault and need some kind of a defense. The fact that there is an Islamist element to the response, I don't think should be all that surprising, given the nature of the onslaught. I think it is a bit unfair to suggest that a photograph of a guy with a beard suggests jihadists' motives. I just think that's unfair. There is not in Syria a tradition of sectarian bloodletting. Okay? What we're seeing, though, is a situation that, in my view, closely resembles what happened in the former Yugoslavia. It wasn't as if Serbs and Croats spent all their time laying in ambush for one another. This was manipulated quite deliberately by some very skillful political manipulators. And this is what has happened in Syria, and Bashar al-Assad has been the manipulator supreme.
Gentleman over here.
Hi, my name is Dimitri. Thank you. Very interesting. I just have a kind of two-part question. First, I went to an event recently. It was kind of Russia and Iran focused, and when I asked them about the UN talks, they portrayed them as kind of just a confrontation between Saudi Arabia and Iran. I'm just wondering if you see it that way, and if you could just comment a little bit on the UN talks, if you think that's the right diplomatic road. And Mr. Hoff, I agree with you about the coalition to send troops to fight ISIS, and I think it will largely take away from Russia's excuse to continue bombing. And my question is, do you think it should be done before there's a settlement to the rest of Syria, or immediately and then? And for Mr. Hanjani, I appreciate what you're saying about finding this settlement between Riyadh and Tehran and moving forward with that. Do you think that it's possible to do that fast enough? Because it seems like we have quite a humanitarian crisis, so it's kind of urgent. So how do you see that happening, and is it possible to do it fast enough? Thank you.
Maybe Amir, why don't you go first? Sure. How long is it going to take?
Your guess is as good as mine. When things get really, really bad, probably much worse than it is today, the answer to the problems of the Middle East lie in the Middle East. They can't be imposed by the United States, Europe, even Russia. I mean, Russia right now is a mess. They're dealing with Ukraine. They've got sanctions. They're deploying assets also to Syria. How long can that last? Who knows? But I think it would be wishful thinking to think that the U.S. can bring two rivals in the region that are at odds over a political dispute that happened 1,400 years ago around the table to finesse them to a conclusion. So I think that only Tehran and Riyadh know.
Are there channels between the Iranians and the Saudis still? I mean, they've broken diplomatic relations now, so they don't even have low-level diplomats in each other's capitals.
I believe there are. I think they have back channels. They've always had back channels. They maintain very strong back channels. I'm not sure how effective they are right now, because when you're talking past each other and you have such diametrically opposed goals, you can talk to your rival, but if your goals are different, you end up helplessly being in conflict.
Yeah,
There are academics meeting on the two sides, but they don't seem to go anywhere,
yeah.
my impression.
And it was a huge blow, obviously, losing both King Abdullah and Saud al-Faisal, right, who had long-time connections with Rafsanjani, Rouhani, people
Particularly
like that.
King Abdullah.
Yeah.
He had very good channels with the Iranians, and not just with Rafsanjani, but even under Ahmadinejad. I mean, Ahmadinejad went to Mecca. He went to Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
The foreign minister would go. I mean, they were talking. They were always disagreeing with each other, but at least they were talking.
Yeah.
I think Fred had a
Yeah.
Just
Sure.
one aspect of this. Look, as an Army veteran of Vietnam and the Lebanese Civil War, I am not on the lookout for opportunities to deploy American forces anywhere in the world. If I were on active duty now, I don't know how I and my family could withstand these constant, repetitive deployments. I'll tell you what worries me, though. What happened in Paris on November the 13th was orchestrated by ISIS in Raqqa, Syria, its Syrian capital. What worries me is something similar happening in Lincoln, Nebraska. And then a president of the United States, who surely has no more desire to deploy young Americans, men and women in uniform, than I do, will have no choice, which is why I find it bewildering that the United States has not taken steps, at least until now, to at least put into place the planning elements of a multinational coalition, a respectable ground force to go into Syria to put paid to ISIL in Syria once and for all. Why does it have to be all Americans?
But can I just follow up on Fred's point?
Sure.
When you say, Fred, once and for all, it's never really once and for all unless
No,
you're
go to Libya.
prepared to sit in Syria and occupy Syria. Because as we saw in Iraq, once we left Iraq, the whole thing unraveled. So I'm not sure. We can go and obliterate Raqqa and go and send ground forces into Syria, but then you have to hold it and you have to rebuild it. And if you break it, you own it.
The sum total of the American experience abroad does not come down to Iraq 2003 or Libya 2011. It is not beyond the wit of American planners to put together a reasonable, rational, and executable civil-military stabilization plan. This has been done. It has been done post-World War II. The fact that Iraq 2003 was a monumental screw-up, the fact that Tony Zinni's stabilization plan was fed into the shredder before the operation took place, that should not be a deterrent to any attempt on the part of the United States to do things correctly.
When have we done things correctly when we put ground forces in the Middle East and we've left? Afghanistan. What about Afghanistan?
I don't want to debate between you two, and I don't want to take sides, but let me just point out that the latest information we were hearing is that the numbers of ISIS folks in Syria is actually going down. And it's gone down from about 30,000 to about 20,000, and there are now 5,000 or more in Libya. So I tend to see it more as a kind of whack-a-mole situation, and if we actually did succeed in expunging them from the Levant, they'd wind up on the Mediterranean. And I think that's something that we have to keep in mind. The gentleman here. Wait for the microphone, please.
Yes, I want to go back to Saudi and Iran. Beirut Hadavi. So, with respect to Syria, I kind of have a sense of what the end game from an Iranian perspective is, which is some type of status ante with some strong man running the show over there, and different minorities, and there are a lot of minorities, are being taken care of, whether they're Christian or Alawites or other types of Shiite or whatever. But what is the end game? What is the picture that the Saudis have in terms of what Syria should look like? When I look at Yemen, when I look at Bahrain, when I look at Saudi Arabia itself, when I look at other Arab countries that experienced the uprising and what Saudi has done with respect to those, it is unclear to me. Opposing Iran is really not a policy. It's just a negative reaction.
Very good question.
So,
yeah, let me address that to David. What do you think what do you think the Saudis
Syria?
Realistically think they can do with Syria now?
Well, what they'd like to see is Syria to stay together. But the Saudis get pretty pragmatic when they have to. And I think they're going to have to become pretty pragmatic. I think in Yemen, they're really determined to hold out and to get rid of the Houthis and to get rid of Iranian influence. But Syria, they realize there are all these other foreign powers, Turkey, Russia, the United States. They're all involved there, and that their ability to impose a solution is really minor compared to the other players. So I think in the end, they will adapt to what they have to adapt to. Whether Assad stays or goes, or stays for 16 or 18 months and then goes, they will learn to live with Assad if they have to. But it won't be a happy arrangement, and they'll be fighting each other. The war will not continue. It will just become at a lower level. But they do want to keep Syria together. They want to keep Iraq together. So I think their policy right now is they have to back the rebels who are asking for sort of the maximum of their position. Assad goes. But they realize they're going to have to compromise in Syria. But they're not going to compromise in Yemen.
David, how strong is Saudi support for the Nusra Front?
They like the Nusra Front because they're Islamic, but they're nationalist. They're Syrian nationalist. Whereas ISIL, or Daesh, is internationalist, doesn't care about borders, boundaries, wants to create. So they harbor this hope that you can somehow recuperate Jabhat al-Nusra in the process of getting them to work with other groups, the Free Syrian Army, the groups in the north, the Kurds, etc. So they're from their point of view, they're supporting elements, Islamic groups that they have helped create in Syria that are against ISIL and are Syrian nationalist. That's their objective in terms of which groups they support.
All the way in the back, gentleman back there.
Thank you. Alex Doyle. With the long-term stabilization of Syria and Iraq requiring the will of the local population as well as the influence and investment of regional actors, what is the role of Saudi Arabia and Iran in the reconstruction of Syria and Iraq?
Reconstruction, boy, it's kind of getting ahead of the game, isn't it?
And I think it depends on what sort of government winds up taking over. I mean, if it's the Assad regime, I don't think Saudi Arabia is going to be helping to reconstruct anything.
I don't think Iran will either.
I think neither will with $30 oil. You know, they've got domestic considerations.
You know, May 16th is the 100th anniversary of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, when foreign powers came in and arranged the borders and boundaries, et cetera. What's really amazing to me is 100 years later, here we have foreign powers, Russia, the United States, France, trying to hold together these countries the way they used to be before the Arab Spring. But you still have, you know, I'm not sure, yeah, Iran and Saudi influence is certainly a factor in what's going to happen. But so is what Russia's going to do and what the United States is going to do. And, you know, we're back where we were in 1916.
Gentleman there.
Yeah, I'm Matt Pfeiffer from the Public International Law and Policy Group. I kind of had a question how energy affects this whole thing. There's talk about Saudi Aramco, the state oil company, having an initial public offering possibly, and then also, so I want to know, would that affect this relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran? And also, as more parts of the world are also looking at becoming more green, how is that going to affect Iran and Saudi Arabia and these countries that are so based upon oil and oil revenue?
Sarah, you want to take a stab and then Amir?
With regard to the Saudi Aramco deciding to sell some of its share and considering IPO, I don't think there is any Iran issue as a big decision-making factor in this part of the shares are not going to be high, as you know, and they're not going to be under resources, so reserves. So it's going to be perhaps some of the downstream part and sectors of Saudi Aramco, but not only it brings some cash, but it proves to the world that Saudi Aramco and Saudi Arabia still is an international important player, especially in the energy market and for the banks. Something that I personally don't think that Saudis are playing their games in these such petty ways to, let's say, okay, pushing those banks that are going to offer the shares of Saudi Aramco not to invest in Iran. Even if that's the case, that's going to be some banks. It's not going to be international level. So I don't see that really a game to leverage against Iran. But comparing Saudi Aramco with National Iranian Oil Company, Saudi Aramco will stand much higher, much taller, much more influential in the global energy market and internationally. And if you are going to decide or choose between one, of course you're going to choose the one that is more internationally agreeable. With regard to your second question, oh, the green. Yeah. Well, Iran has a huge gas reserves, and oil is not really a future of Iran. Iran doesn't really plan to increase and expand its oil production. So their main force of Iranian government is to get back to their early 2000 production of 4 million barrels per day, perhaps add some more 500 or 700 from their green fields, green oil fields. Their most force is on the gas. So Iran has huge gas reserves, and they're going to focus a lot on gas. Iran's 65% of domestic energy use is natural gas. The households, the industries, petrochemicals. So most of Iran's domestic consumption is also natural gas, and they're focusing on exporting natural gas. When is it going to happen? Considering Iran's huge domestic demand, that's a question, might be like sometimes after 2020. But with regard to Saudi Arabia, I mean, at the current low oil prices, the producing oil in the region, in the Persian Gulf, especially in Saudi, Iran, the GCC members, it's pretty affordable. And but this is not something that Saudi is looking into the future, because you know that Saudi is going in future, if their demand grow as it is growing, they're going to use most of their crude oil. They're looking into reserves. I don't know how Saudi is fortunate with natural gas. They have some natural gas reserve. In fact, they have a share field of natural gas between Iran and Saudi, which that's a point of tension, especially important and sensitive for Saudi Arabia, because as you know, with the natural gas reserve, whoever start extracting the natural gas first is going to make the most profit from that. So that Farzad B, which is on the Iranian side and share with Saudi, is very important for Saudis. Saudis are doing a very interesting investment around the world on the energy side. They are looking into a very interesting long-term partnership. So I think that Saudi Arabia, in the sense of and Saudi Aramco, looking more in international policies and strategies, is ahead of Iran. But also we should consider that Iran was under significant sanctions for the past few years, and they're just opening up. They're just looking into revising and reforming their domestic policies.
Amir, you have some insights about Aramco. What's that all about?
I'm going to take a slightly different view than Sarah. She's absolutely right with respect to Saudi Aramco being, a titan in the oil industry. They're the world's swing producer. And however, in a world where oil, today's world, is a lot different than the world of 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, and what's changed it is technology, and U.S. technology, and fracking, and shale, and that's made oil an abundance. You find it, everywhere that you couldn't find it before, especially here in the United States. So yes, Saudi is making investments in refineries, and they're an international player, but their foreign reserves, their cash is dwindling, and they're going into the international market, and they're going to raise debt. And if they continue at this pace, they're going to go through their cash reserves the next 5 or 6 years. And while banks, international banks, are keen to lend to them now because they see the cash there and they see the reserves in the ground, if oil stays, in a band between $20 and $40, how relevant is Saudi production going to be when the U.S. is going to be producing more and more, Russia is producing, Iran will be producing, Iraq will be producing, Australia. I mean, we're already oversupplied 2 to 3 million barrels a day, and the Iran and Saudi Arabia both have this issue. However, I think Iran can weather the storm better because around 15 to 20% of their GDP is based on their exporting of energy. The sanctions have made the Iranian economy much more robust domestically. They produce things. They produce things that Saudi Arabia doesn't. Saudi Arabia sells oil to the world. They don't really do much of anything else.
Yeah. I was at an event with Ken Katzman, the Congressional Research Service, who said that now in the current Iranian budget, it's only 23% of the revenues are oil related. And he also noted that Iran, the second biggest industry in Iran now is automobile manufacturing, and that Iran is actually exporting some of these cars in the region, I guess, presumably in Central Asia and so on. So he thought that, he said Iran was poised like a spring to rebound with sanctions relief and become a light manufacturing hub. And you certainly can't say that about Saudi Arabia. I wanted to ask you, David, maybe Sarah Amir knows something about this as well, a factoid that I picked up. Saudi Arabia will need $133 billion worth of investment in electricity over the next decade to meet demand, according to its electricity and water minister. How will the Saudis meet this demand? Are they going to use oil, or are they going to, in a logical world, they'd buy natural gas from Iran and use that, but that's not going to happen.
Well, the thing is that Saudis even are not buying natural gas from Qatar. Many people are just talking about, okay, Saudis are not buying gas from Iran because Iran is Shia, they're Sunni, they're rivalries, but they're also not buying natural gas from Qatar, really. So this, the notion of depending on your energy resources that is very vital to your sustain and maintenance, and you as a country with hugest oil reserves really in the world is not yet a very comfortable feeling for Saudis, but they're moving toward controlling their demand, of course, because there is the efficiency of consumption in Saudi is really low. Like people travel abroad during the summer, but their ACs are on for months a year, and they put their ACs perhaps on 60 degree Fahrenheit. So all these programs that the young leaders in Saudi are really promoting, reducing the subsidies on the fuel, are going to change all of this. Again, the prospects of the market is not that the prices are going to remain for 20 to 40 for a long time. So even in the next 2-3 years, the prospect, even in the next 12 months, the market's situation is contango. So it's expected that the prices are going to rebound. So they're not going to remain like $20 to $40 for the next like 5 years, 6 years. And these are all important. Of course, Saudi is really in need of electricity. They're using their own crude oil.
Yeah.
And if they continue using their own crude oil, they don't have much for export. But looking into Saudi's strategic plans, they already did lots of planning. You know that they are putting a lot of force on their mining. They're integrating their downstream and their petrochemical industry. So they are looking into diversifying in their economy. Yes, I don't compare the Saudi's economy with Iran economy. There is a huge gap, huge differences. But I see that Saudi leadership reached to that understanding and realization, and they are launching many different plans and programs to prevent what you mentioned of just consuming their oil in future and being an oil-dependent economy for a long time.
David, do you see Saudi becoming more energy efficient anytime soon? Do you think? And how are people responding to these subsidy cuts?
Yeah, they have to. They have to become more energy efficient, and they're also going into solar energy. They realize they have an incredible
resource called the sun.
Sun, 11 months a year or whatever. So they are beginning to diversify into alternative energy. I think Sarah was talking about, or you were talking about the $100 and whatever billion
Yeah,
electricity.
that they apparently need.
The Saudis have all these sector things where you keep hearing they're going to invest $100 billion.
How many $100 billion
It can't
do they
happen.
have?
They're going to have to choose between which of projects. But they're certainly developing the gas to get off so that they can export more because they're consuming more every year. They're exporting now? 7 million out of 10.2. And every year, I think it's 6% a year they increase local consumption of oil they need. So there's a lot of discussion about when will they not be able to export any at all.
Any oil, yeah.
But they know they have these problems. The good news is they know they have these problems and they're trying to work on them. But how they're going to square all these, in transportation, building of railroads, I mean, you name it. They have a 5-year plan to spend $100 billion. Well, there's no way they can do it. So.
Well, and something that is interesting is that we often forget the petrochemical industry in Saudi, which unfortunately is petroleum-based because they don't have so much gas, and again, they're not importing gas from Iran or Qatar. But they are developing and they are building the downstream petrochemical sector. For instance, now I noticed that their carpet industry is raising the synthetic carpets from their own petrochemical products. So it's very interesting that they're adding value added and increasing the downstream chain of their petrochemical industry into other industries, and they're trying to diversify their exports.
Okay. Right here.
Hi, Dana Stuster. Thanks for this great discussion. I was hoping you might talk a bit about Lebanon. A couple months ago, there were rumors that some sort of Saudi-Iranian compromise on governance was imminent. Since January, that's more or less disappeared, and last week, Walid Jumblat was tweeting coyly about the next leader arriving on a Persian carpet. And over the weekend, there was speculation that Saudi Arabia might respond to the siege of Aleppo by opening a front in Lebanon.
Oh, dear Lord.
So how is the Saudi-Iranian conflict playing out in Lebanon these days?
Have you been following that, Fred? I mean, for a while I thought it was going to be Tony Frangia, and then I heard
they were
Michel
trying to work out
Aoun
a compromise.
for a president, which they have not had for a
Hariri
while.
offered Frangia instead of Aoun. This gets into the weeds of Lebanese politics, but the bottom line is it didn't work out. And Hezbollah is sticking with Aoun, and the sort of March 14th really is sort of the attempt to make a compromise. Hezbollah, and I presume Iran behind them in Syria, said, no, we're sticking with Aoun. They're both Christians, by the way, which is kind of, this is the mess the Christians are in Lebanon as much as the conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia. But I read it as, you know, that the Iran-Syrian Hezbollah axis is holding tough in Lebanon, and they're not going to accept, even though Frangia is very pro-Syrian, they wouldn't accept that compromise.
Yeah, I think for the head of Nasrallah, for the Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah, this presented a bit of a dilemma because the way the Aoun candidacy suddenly had new oxygen pumped into it was Aoun was endorsed by Samir Jaja,
Another warlord.
another big Christian Maronite kingpin. And Aoun sat down with Jaja, and they worked out some kind of a Lebanon first compact, which may have contradicted in some ways Aoun's understanding going back quite some time with Hezbollah. So for Nasrallah, this was a bit of a dilemma. I think in the end, what he decided was that his long-standing relationship with Aoun should be honored, and therefore I think the Frangier side of this equation is probably dead, but who knows for sure.
And let's see. Was the gentleman back there had a question? Do you still have a question? Yeah. I'll wait for the microphone, please.
Doug Bergner. I was curious, your conversation just looking kind of ahead a little bit in terms of Iran. We're sort of assuming Iranian leadership is going to be the same going forward. I mean, is there any prospect for different set of attitudes, different kinds of points of view? And part of the assumption with the Iran nuclear deal was that there may be some emergence of a slightly different set of issues coming out of Tehran. Is everybody just assume this is status quo for the foreseeable future, or is there some play in this?
Well, I think that it's important to remember that the nuclear deal, I mean, people give Rouhani and Zarif a lot of credit, and they should, for orchestrating the Iranian side of the deal, but they wouldn't get past the door if it wasn't for those behind them. And really the supreme leader able to sort of balance the very hardline factions in Iran and basically saying, you know, we're going to do this. And he gave a number of speeches to that effect, calling for heroic flexibility and supporting his negotiators at a time when it was quite unpopular to do so. Any changes with respect to Iranian policy, it's not a monolith. They have a very robust internal dynamic. We have elections coming up for the Assembly of Experts. We have parliamentary elections coming up as well. It'll be incremental, and it'll really be decided by which way the regime as a whole views their security and views their threats. If they view their relationship with their regional neighbors, with the United States, as improving, they could take a softer line on some issues. If they view the region as going against their interests and the U.S. becoming more hostile, then the pendulum could swing the other way. So they react to sort of what's going on around them.
There's something called the Supreme Council of National Security. The Supreme Leader has a representative, the President the defense minister, the head of the IRGC, and these kinds of decisions are made collectively. And I don't know how much you should read into this, but it was all over Twitter. There was a picture of Qasem Soleimani, who's the head of the Quds Force, wearing a jacket that said the North Face on it. So Supreme Leader has said no American products, right? But there was Qasem Soleimani looking very cheerful. I don't know if it was in Syria or Iraq.
It's probably a knockoff.
Yeah, I know. It was a big debate on Twitter about whether it was a knockoff or whether it was genuine. So I think we should ship large quantities of North Face to him. Maybe it'll soften him up toward the United States. I think we're coming to a close. Any final questions? Yeah. I have to ask you, Fred. I mean, will we at least make some progress on the humanitarian side, or is that too much to hope for? Basically, John Kerry has now said he understands that the Russians have tricked him. Maybe he hasn't said that in so many words, but there was a hope at least that there would be some progress on the humanitarian front, some localized ceasefires and ability to get humanitarian aid into some of these besieged areas. What do you think?
There's been a lot of discussion in the International Syria Support Group that has focused on the lifting of sieges. Mm-hmm. Quick commercial, we have a program on this tomorrow here at the council, I believe at noon. But this is where much of the discussion is focusing, and this indeed is where Iran, if it wishes to play, notwithstanding its political objectives in Syria, if it wishes to play a positive role in the country, it can lean on its client to lift the sieges that are currently starving and inflicting pestilence on upwards of 600,000 Syrian civilians. If Iran can do that, perhaps there can be some change in the dynamic in a positive direction.
Well, on that hopeful note, I think we'll close our discussion, and thank you all very much for coming. Thanks, Fred. It's a pleasure to have you.